the other way around was that we had as one, when we put in our proposal for the Postqualitative Research Collective at the NRF, the first year we didn't get it, but we thought it was just such a good ideas that were in it. And one of them was to start a postqualitative series. And so when we didn't get that first year the grant, then we thought, oh, we're going to go to Routledge anyway. And then they said, oh, that's a really good idea. So in a very interesting way, it's a bit the other way around. When you go to the Postqualitative Research Collective, which is postqualitativeresearch.com, what you will see is that there's not only the collective itself, and George is working hard on it, but also that there is a book series. So if you yourself, or maybe someone you know, is interested in either writing or reading books from this particular series, you're very welcome to. And it is a very interesting one in the sense that it tries to offer the other kind of dimension, which normally speaking, we don't have when we just have the 2D writing. So there's an opportunity for you to also have videos and audios and podcasts on the website. But if you want to know more, get in touch with either George or myself or with Roseanne. And unless I've forgotten anything, I'll just hand you over to Roseanne, who will be difficultating this meeting.
Thank you, Karen. And just, I'm really just to say a very warm welcome to Candace and to Mitzi. I'm going to be doing, as Karen said, the difficultating work, which is kind of listening. We're all going to be listening in different ways, but I'm going to be particularly listening and looking out for any comments from those in the audience. But I'm very excited that Mitzi and Candace will be guiding us this afternoon, and we will be learning from them and through them. And quite importantly, they're going to start off, we've asked them to start off by telling us a little story about how they came to know each other, because they have a particular relationship as supervisor and student from many years ago. So I'm actually not going to say much more, but I want to say thank you to Karen. I know you just got off a plane, literally rolled out the door a couple of minutes ago and rolled up into your place. And to everyone else, it is a working week. We know that people are busy, and it's morning for some and it's afternoon for others. So grab a cup of tea or have some water, but feel welcome to be in this space. And let's imagine we are together learning together. So we try and give you the idea that you can be as comfortable as possible. And we are aware that we have some issues around connectivity. So let's be patient and generous with each other if we have some of those difficulties. So I'm going to hand over to Candace and Mitzi. And actually, wait, I thought I'd start with the title because it's actually really important. We spend a lot of time thinking about this. So today we're talking about speculative. Thank you, Candace. Actually, you spend a lot of time thinking about it, but it's important to say. Today, we're going to be talking about speculative relational pedagogies within literacies. And I introduce you to Candace Kuby and Mitzi Lewison. Thank you.
Candace, you want to start?
Sure, I'd be happy to, Mitzi. Well, hello, everyone. This is such a treat, such a pleasure. Thank you, Karen, George, Roseanne, all your behind the scenes work. It was quite fun to spend some time myself rereading these papers, and I'm especially looking forward to the conversation with each of you. Also, I want to just acknowledge the co-authors that were a part of the thinking and writing with me who are not with us today in this sense, but they are in another sense, because I'm always thinking about our collaborations, our talks, our times in classrooms together. So Becky and Tara are very much a part of this conversation today. And so Mitzi and I do have a history together, and I've been looking forward to this today because it's been a while since we've been in dialogue together, but Mitzi was my PhD advisor at Indiana University. I started there in 2006, I believe, graduated in 2010. And so it's been about 13 years. And so I don't know, Mitzi, if we want to each tell our story of how that came to be. We've never actually talked about this, so it will be a surprise to us both to hear how the other narrates
Really?
this. Would you like me to start?
Sure, go ahead.
Sure. Okay. Well, a little bit of background behind, for me, I grew up in Alabama, which is a southern part of the United States, and I taught in kindergarten and first grade classrooms for several years while I did my undergrad and master's in early childhood education. Then I spent a year in Japan teaching in 4 different preschools there, 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. And when I returned to the US, I started my doctoral program at Indiana University. And I will say I did visit several campuses as I was making decisions about where to go for my doctoral degree. And I remember visiting one spring break and just felt at home in the moment that I got to sit in on some classes and have dinner with some of the current doctoral students. So I think it was a really good fit for me. I'm glad that's where I landed. And so my time at Indiana was full of rich intellectual thinking and conversations with Mitzi as my advisor, as well as other committee members such as Karen Woolwin, James D'Amico, and Barbara Dennis. And Gerald Campano was there at the time as well. And so it was a really great space, a lot of thinking around multimodal literacies and critical literacies, a lot of reading of different theorists. I think the one thing I reflect on most, Mitzi, is I remember coming back to Indiana University a few years later for one of the discourse analysis conferences, and somebody said to me, there's this new book out by somebody named Lisa Matse and Alicia Jackson. It's called Thinking with Theory. And they're like, I think you would really like it. And I do. I love that book and I read it. But when I read it, I realized what a gift it was to have you as my advisor, because for many years you would say to me, what would James G say about this data? What would whoever we were reading at the time? And so in a sense, Mitzi, you were already inviting me to think with theory before that term became a term, or before that book really became what it has become. So thank you so much for those invitations to be able to be experimental and to think and to kind of play with data and thinking in that way.
Well, Candace, thanks so much. And boy, I tell you, it is interesting that we have kind of never talked about this. But during her dissertation, Candace started kind of moving away from, she still had some traditional qualitative methods going on, but she started reading and moving toward post-qualitative inquiry. And that was something that I knew absolutely nothing about at the time. And Candace, I don't know if you remember this, but there were a number of times where you helped me to understand some of your post-qualitative thinking and what you were messing around with. I still think of you explaining rhizomatic analysis to me, and then you were making drawings that explained Luce and Gutierrez's lines of flight. I don't know if you remember that or not, but I just thought, oh my gosh, I am learning so much from this student. So Candace came in with a background from a lot of people who had kind of similar perspectives on inquiry as I did. And then she moved me forward. So I think about my work with Candace. It's actually probably Candace's work on me definitely busted the teacher-student binary. So I thank you so much for that, Candace.
I think I might still have those sketchings somewhere, Mitzi, in an old binder or something, but I do know exactly what you're talking about.
Fantastic. And just before you start, Candace and Mitzi, I just want to remind, thank you so much for that story. And I find it telling that that it was the first time you've spoken about it or chatted about how you came to be. And I just, thank you for what kind of, I love what you said about invitations to be experimental with data, and yet you remain experimental with your data now, even, Candace. And I'm sure for you too, Mitzi, that the changes that Candace, those changes are ongoing, remain with you. I just realized we left something out that was important, that for the last 3 weeks, we've had a small reading group that's been reading Candace and her co-authors' papers. And so what Mitzi and Candace have done is they weren't at those reading groups specifically, but they've been listening to the recordings and to the questions that came up from the participants and myself, and they're going to be working through some of those questions and additional questions that those questions pose. So that's actually a very deep philosophical move where your questions open up other questions. So I'm going to say, Mitzi, I think you are ready to begin. So thanks, and off you go.
Great. So we thought about starting with the first paper, and basically, I'm just going to give a few comments about what struck me and one of my questions. And then as I listened to the recordings, I jotted down all of your questions too. So we'll start with a few of those and see if we can get through the papers. And then there are definitely themes that run through all three of these that we probably want to pick up on. So Roseanne, do you want to kind of be a timer on how we move from paper to paper, maybe?
Absolutely. I'll keep an eye, and I think we could probably, I'll give you some indication that we're ready to move to the next one. Okay, so probably 15 minutes should be good for each of them, and then that gives us time. Okay.
Okay, so the first paper, Rethinking Children as Fully Inhuman and Literacies as Otherwise Through Re-Etymologizing, Intervene, and Inequality. So I just want to start out with, as usual, Candace, everything is really well written. It's a good story on top of being really cutting edge research. I really love the focus on the mundane classroom episodes rather than the data that glows. I think that we all kind of have a tendency to go to that glowing data. And I think this was a really important point. I also appreciated how when you were talking about the game, that it wasn't an extra, that it was literacy. And there were some questions about this. Is it literacy? Is it not literacy? That we'll probably get to that were in the discussion. Maybe more important, I found the way that you worked with a group of authors or theories from different perspectives, and then you stuck with the tensions and the contradictions that they present. This is really generative and refreshing. For me, these diffractive readings and thinkings are really helpful in moving away from using groups of authors or theories to define or nail down a particular perspective or point of view. The other thing that I thought was really important in this piece was the re-etymologizing.
Eu tô na correria aqui, tá? Mas à medida que tu tiver qualquer tipo de dúvida.
Whoop. And why I thought this was so important is you talked about not doing this to know it or to nail down the definition, but to remake the word differently. And this reclaiming intervention as becoming, to me, is just so important. It's kind of a wake-up call that we continue to use these words over and over, and we don't question them. And like language, we kind of become stuck in them. And this was a way to break out of that, which I really appreciated. So this is my question, and then I'll get to a couple of questions that came from the group. And actually, this first question was kind of in the group. Yeah. But if I understand you correctly, in this paper, and also the frictional matterings, and a little bit in the third paper, you wrote about identity markers as usually as binaries, male, female, black, white, and then subjectivity as a process that comes into being through relational fields, the human, non-human, more than human. Can you talk about the differences and relationships between identity and subjectivity? You said they work together but aren't the same, and I'd love to hear more on this.
Sure, and I'll just admit that I think as a writer, you choose to write papers that help you think through things that you're still wrestling with. And so I think very much, like you said, all three of these papers touch on this exploration about identity and subjectivity. I think for me, and it comes really, Mitzi, from my years at IU and all the readings I did in critical theories, and then the shift moving into some of the post philosophies. And so I think I've been struggling for 15 years or more about this word identity and about subjectivity and their relationship or not with each other. And so for me, I think I'm finally at a place where I felt like I wanted to write about it more publicly. And so as you can see, that's in the papers here today. I think part of it, especially situated here in the US, myself as someone who's grown up in the South as a white, able-bodied, I think a lot about my relationships in the world and my histories and experiences. And that really came to the forefront for me in my doctoral program as I was reading about critical pedagogies, critical literacies. And so I think a lot of it is the struggle for me to think about this notion of identity, social justice, these labels or categories that we often hear about in our scholarly fields. And how do I reconcile that? How do I put it in conversation with some of the post-philosophers that I find really generative? And so that's kind of the why behind it, why I'm thinking about it a lot. I think part of it is some of the larger critiques, especially like in literacy education, which almost like pits critical theories, perspectives, and then like post-feminist new materialists separately in some way. So even if you go to a conference, there's separate special interest groups. There's these ways that we've drawn circles around and excluded and included different thoughts. And so for me, I think I'm really trying to think across and in between. So I think that's the backstory, Mitzi. So your question again, though, ask me the last question that you said there. You want me to talk a little bit about?
Yeah, I want you to talk a little bit about the differences and relationships between identity and subjectivity.
Yeah.
You talk about them working together, but not being the same, and how you tease those out.
Yeah.
At this point.
At this point, right? It's such a hard question because I feel like I'm still in the middle of teasing it out. I think for me, identity, the way that I read about it or hear, people talk about it is often categories that sometimes sound static or labels that, might come across as monolithic or static in some way. And I think the work on intersectionality has really helped us to think about the interconnected ways that we have different histories and identities. But it still didn't feel the explanatory power, I guess I would say, it wasn't quite there still. And when I were in classroom spaces and thinking about the children and the more than human in classroom spaces, there was something about the becoming in the moment. And so I think for me, subjectivity really helps me to understand while all the humans and the more than humans that come into a classroom space have these histories, life experiences, where we don't all experience the world in the same way. There's different privileges. But in the moment in classroom spaces, I really think about what's becoming there when each of these are together in a collective and emergent space. And to me, that's what helps me think about how subjectivity is an ongoing process. It's not a thing, it's not fixed, it's not static. It's constantly becoming in relation with. And I think about like myself a lot, like who am I in the world? And there's not a single story. There is a very complicated, nuanced history, but also in each relationship or pocket of relations that I'm a part of, I come to be in different ways. And so I think that subjectivity helps me to think about that a little bit more. And I think some of the philosophers and scholars that are trying to think about that in very ethical and just ways. And I feel like I'm drawn to it because I think I'm frustrated sometimes in discussions on social justice that really think about systems. And sometimes it can feel really defeating or like nothing's ever changing. And so for me, what I find really hopeful about the ways that post-philosophers think about subjectivity, it is about it's the both and that I like about it. It's about there are these kind of larger systems and discourses and ways of being, but at the same time, those mundane, everyday relationships make our world. And I think about classroom spaces where I hear teachers talk about mandates or curricular mandates, or I can't do this, or I've been told I can't do this. And while that's true, it's also true that there are things that are happening in the mundane every day that produce that space, produce literacies, produce relationships differently. So I think that's why I find conversations around subjectivity so generative for us to think about making our world in different ways.
And people can join in with questions too. So Candace, do you see then I'm trying to understand this. I mean, this is kind of how I read it, that the identity piece are those markers that we've used for a long time. The binaries basically is what you're talking about. And subjectivity as a way to maybe not move beyond those, but to we are becoming in those, and it's not static. Are you seeing the identity as kind of static? I guess that's a question.
I think sometimes when I read scholarship, it feels that way. We make these neat tables that say this many girls, this many boys, this many are Black, this many are white. And it seems like this static thing on the paper, not to mean that the scholars that are writing it think that way, but I think the way it gets produced into the machine of the academy sometimes feels very much static, as if all 9 people that are labeled girl are experiencing the world in the same way and come to be in the same way. So I think for me, it's that they are binaries, but I'm not saying we can get rid of them. It's very much how our world functions. So how do we work within and against them at the same time to open up new and different ways of thinking? So I think I don't want to create another binary because I think it's very much the structures of our discourse about how the world is set up, institutions and structures. But I guess I want to just open the question about what if we thought about it in different ways? What might that produce for spaces? So that's kind of what I'm thinking, Mitzi.
Thank you, Candace and Mitzi. So maybe we could just kind of let some of what you've both said settle a bit, and maybe, as Mitzi has said, there's a comment or a question from the group now. We welcome that, otherwise we'll move on. So let's just give ourselves about 20 seconds to think a bit. Okay, I think well, Hilary's put her camera on. Hilary, I don't know if that means something, but yeah, I think we're all just really enjoying listening to the way you're thinking, Candace, and are able to articulate yourself in this particular way. So, Mitzi, did you want? Karen has a. Thanks, Karen.
Unless Mitzi had something, but I mean, would one way, Candace, a way of sort of describing it is that identity is often, it's epistemological and subjectivity ontological.
That's interesting, Karen. I mean, I definitely feel the way that we talk about human subjects often in qualitative research, which we label with these identity categories often, is a very epistemological focus. We are looking to see what children know, what skills, kind of, have they mastered certain objectives. And I definitely feel like the philosophers that write about subjectivity in these ways are really, it's the ethico onto epistemology, I think, is that our knowing and being and doing in the world, are not separable. And I think that's sort of what I feel like my larger kind of focus is when I think about pedagogies, is what's being produced for me in classroom spaces is a very ontological question. And I'm not sure that we always focus on that in educational research. I think often it's epistemological conversations for sure.
Yeah, and just to, the example of child adult, to what extent do we bring those kind of subjects into the world through these ethical and onto-epistemological categories, as you were saying, so, yeah. So, and but they they don't match, or what is the word I'm looking for? They're not expression of the way the world is, but that's how we constitute it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, yeah. Okay, so it's just a comment really, and also at the very same time a question whether that made sense to you as a yeah, but it's very intriguing. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, there is a comment in the group from Constantinos Georgia. Constantinos, I don't know if you'd like to say it, or I'm happy to read it for you.
Yes. So thank you very much, Candace. It's already very thought-provoking what you have already said, and I've been working with subjectivity for many years, and I'm trying to understand this the differential becoming in terms of becoming an identity or becoming a subject, and I would like your input in terms of how it differs, perhaps, or something like that. Thank you.
That's a tough question. I mean, a simple answer I would say is I think about identity often are sometimes things that people label. We self-identify, but also others identify us in particular ways. And so I think when I think of identity categories, often, they're labeled honest. Or for example, if we're a classroom teacher and we have children in our classroom, there might be assumptions or ways of thinking about a particular student because of maybe the more visible identity markers. There's also some that aren't so visible. And I think as a teacher, sometimes assumptions are made, or at least in a US context in many schools, Black bodies, especially young boys, might receive different instruction, disciplinary patterns, and things like that. And so I think of identity categories sometimes as ones that are put on us, also ones we might self-identify. And so the notion of becoming identity is interesting. I would love to hear others' thoughts on that. I don't know if I have an answer if becoming identity and becoming subjectivity, if I would use both of those terms or not, but perhaps there's an argument that that is the case.
Okay, so if we try to make out a particular scenario, let's say that I've been nominalized as a learning disabled student, how it differs to become an identity, to acquire the identity of a learning disabled student instead of becoming a subject that it's becoming a subject through the learning disabling phenomena and all these things. So would you say that this differs?
Constantinos, can I ask you to hold on to that question and that thought? And part of the dilemma of the work we're trying to do is how do we live with questions that could be troubling. So I'm going to ask you if we could pause that. Just because I have the incredible job of keeping to time, which is difficult in life and in academia. So I'm going to ask Mitzi if she has one more question about this paper for Candace to speak to and respond to. And then we'll return to your question, Constantinos, at the end, if we're able. Okay, Mitzi.
Okay, so boy, do I have a lot from that group conversation that took place 3 weeks ago. But let me go to this one about, is the game board literacy itself, the Adam and everything that he created. And there's kind of another question that went along with that, is how do we get students to positions where they can read and write kind of the power of traditional literacies, and they do need to do that. And how does all this fit together, and how do you see it working, and what is literacy, I guess, is at the bottom of that one.
Yeah, I would love to just do a little poll here and raise your hand if you think the game board is literacy or not. Who here would say that it is? Thumbs up, hands up. Okay, so at least the ones I can see are agreeing. So yeah, I think for myself and Tara, this is what we've spent a number of years thinking about. we started our partnership my first year here at Mizzou in 2010, and she felt like writing instruction was the area that she felt least confident in as a teacher. And so that's the reason that we started playing and thinking together about writing instruction. And we always use the term writing, but over the years, you know, what counts as writing was really our question. And some of it depended on who is asking and what the consequences might be for our answer from that person who's asking. And so I think, you know, we would hesitate to nail down, is it or is it not literacy? Because I think once we start defining what literacy is, we start then drawing these boundaries and exclusionary lines around it. But at the same time, it's important that we also say it's a literacy, I think, in the politics of a school setting. Because it does legitimize it in some way. Oftentimes, at least where Tara's teaching and in our context, you know, there's not time for play anymore. Children shouldn't be playing, they should be learning. So there's all these discourses around what should be happening during instructional time. And so we also found that by saying that they were creating things like this game board or three-dimensional, you know, cabins or whatever they were doing, by attaching it to a learning standard and by saying that it's happening in writing studio, which is what she began to call that space, it legitimizes it somewhat for your principal or for parents who might question that this isn't learning or this should not be happening during instruction in school. So I think it's the both and, but it's also situational and contextual in some way. But I think largely speaking, we're still just wrestling with kind of that ontological question about, you know, what are literacies? And then Nathan Snanza's work, who I've cited here, you know, talks about like, it's almost impossible to try to define what's literacy. And because once we do that, I think it might shut down possibilities is how I'm thinking about it. I personally do think it's a literacy, and definitely because it was situated in like a unit of study on personal narratives. And so in that sense, but I have gotten a lot of pushback from people when I call it a literacy or some of these other kind of literacy desirings, that it's not literacy. So I know there's debate.
Thank you, Mitzi, for that question, and Candace for your response. Mitzi, we have a question from Hilary Jank, so we'll take that one. And then maybe after Hilary's, Mitzi, we could move on to the next paper. Okay, thanks, Hilary.
So, Candace, I've been wrestling with the same question, and I'm wondering if thinking about the different modes of the different literacies and their different affordances of the different literacies, what helps us to distinguish different kinds of meaning making, if you like, or different kinds of writing. So if you write in one, or if you compose in one mode and you compose in a different mode, you're going to have different possibilities and challenges. And that it worries me that if we collapse them all, we lose some of those distinctions. So writing is different from designing a board game. And they tell personal narratives in different ways. So while I might be inclined to call them both literacies, I'd be less inclined to call them both writing. I want to know if you, because I'm really struggling with this myself at the moment. We've been reading Hackett's latest book. And I mean, there, you know, she explodes meaning making, learning, literacy. For me, the distinctions very often are blurred. So I'm wondering if you thinking about the multimodal part of literacies is helpful, or that if you call it literacy but you don't call it writing, you're going to get the pushback. But I do think that sometimes the distinctions are helpful, and that's what I'm wrestling with, because you state very clearly that these are not literacies on the way to writing, or literacies becoming writing. They're literacies in their own right, and I agree with that. And I also think that kids have to learn to use these different modes because they're out there, you know, as forms of expression, communication. Some are more embodied. It brings us closer to the way non-humans communicate, because they don't communicate in writing, but they're also communicating. And then I'm also wondering about the distinction between literacy and communicating. So you can see I'm trying to wrestle with the same things, and I also don't have answers. I just would like to know what your take on that is.
Yeah, well, two things. Abby Hackett, we've had a number of conversations. You know, she has shared when she's gotten rejections, you know, from a manuscript because the reviewers don't agree with what she's calling literacy a literacy. So I know we've both struggled with how we talk about, you know, what we're up to in the world, and what we label it matters. And even in the academy, what a journal reviewer will agree or disagree because of it. So there's a lot of connections there. Yeah, I think the way that Tara and I thought about it pedagogically when we struggled with this is that alphabetic versus something like multimodal, or traditional versus, you know, and it was this binary that we realized we were, you know, not creating, it's there, but like we were living in that. And then, so how does she pedagogically then invite students to be writers? Because go be a writer was the phrase that she found herself saying when she would put out materials and ask them, you know, to be writers, because we were originally just thinking about multimodal, like writing workshop. That's where we started back in 2010. And then the trouble was when they started creating things that didn't look like writing, but yet she told them to go be a writer with these materials. Do you tell them no? Do you tell them they can't do that? And so I think for her, it was this pedagogical tension of her language and the materials, and what she was sort of allowing to come to be in that space. And so often, I guess the backstory to like this example of Adam's game board is when we would be doing like a unit like personal narrative, she would really ask them to think about the different modes of expression. I mean, she would talk with them about the possibilities. And she would give them a lot of time at the beginning of the school year to simply play with materials. And I remember our first year to try that, she said she was going to give herself 3 days. After that, they would be put back up because, you know, it was just like people would probably walk in her room and think it's chaotic. I mean, there were airplanes flying by our heads, you know, but then she realized after 3 days of just resisting, trying to tame it, how they learned different modes and materials, you know, have these affordances, as you're saying. And so when it came time for like this personal narrative and Adam choosing a game board, I mean, he, you know, they had conversations about what materials, kind of what mode, I guess you could say, what are the possibilities that you want to engage your peers in to experience your personal narrative? And if he had chosen a wall mural, it would have produced a different experience for his peers. And so, and then I think she also began to see over time that alphabetics got incorporated as they needed to. And so it wasn't about planning out ahead of time, here's the writing piece, and then you go make the 3-dimensional or whatever. But as you can see in the game board example, like she didn't tell him he had to make game cards or directions or all these things with alphabetics. It came about in what I would call the revision process, where they would play and test out the game before it was finished. And he realized like that is a mode that I need for people to read the game board directions. And so it was really more kind of the revision or the testing out of the game that students saw when they needed to draw on more traditional versus maybe more multimodal. But that's where the binary became very messy. It's not an either or, it was a both and, kind of depending on what they were hoping their users, you know, would need to engage with whatever they were trying to convey. So it's very messy, Hillary. I don't have an answer either. I think a lot about the word communication, composing, writing, literacy. How are they different? What does each one, you know, connote to a reader? Yeah, it's messy.
I think that was a helpful answer, Candace. Thanks.
Thank you, Hillary, and thank you, Candace. Mitzi, if you'd like to go on to the next paper on frictional
I
mentoring.
will.
Okay, great.
Let me
Thank
move my stuff here from paper to paper.
you. Okay.
So paper 2 was frictional matterings, rethinking identity and subjectivity in the coming to be of literacies. Again, as in the last paper, you welcome theoretical frictions and contradictions. And in this paper, I really appreciated your writing style, Candace. When you did that pushes and pulls sections, it was a way to focus on the tensions in teaching and research. And I found that very helpful as a way to kind of understand your thinking and your colleagues about these. Another thing that struck me, and this is back to kind of my teacher and working with teacher self, is later in the paper, you mentioned that time, space, and materials are productive for students. And, you know, my first response was, no kidding. I mean, seriously, it seems like something we hear a lot, but that time piece is so important. It's such a guarded phenomena in schools of what gets time and what doesn't. So I really appreciate, especially in the US, I'm not sure about other places, but I imagine it's the same. So that was really important for me that was foregrounded, because a lot of times it's not. So one of my questions, I will only ask one of my questions, but this also came up in the discussion. And this is about the intersectionality piece, that you ask questions about if there can be supportive grids and pinnings when we're thinking about intersectionality. And I'm wondering if you can talk about this more. These pinnings are really powerful. They kind of are the identity piece you were talking about before. And I'm wondering, what does it take for the pinnings to actually be brief, as you talk about, and propel students into new trajectories? How do you pin and release? And once you pin, how does this not become an attribute of the person?
Wow.
Yeah, I know.
Really great question. Now you all have a window into my doctoral experience. Every time Mitzi and I sat down together, there were so many great questions, Mitzi, that you would ask. I mean, I asked you to read these two pieces, the other one first and this one, because as you can see, this one really builds on some of the thinking that Tara and I put out in the previous one, because we wanted more space to think about identity and subjectivity, and specifically with thinkers who maybe aren't the mainstream post-structural kind of thinkers. And so specifically Puar's piece, I'd rather be a cyborg than a goddess, and some of Jennifer Nash's work. So Black feminist, people identify as queer theorists, and also Indigenous scholars like Anna Louise Keating's work. And so I had been reading all of their work sort of separately. And so this was a space to try to think a little bit about how some of these feminist Indigenous philosophers are thinking about identity and subjectivity. And so, in Puar's piece, this notion of identity as eventness, I found really generative. And, I think it says the first part of the article, Puar talks about grids happen, borrowing on Matsumi's work. And so this notion of grids happening was really generative for the three of us as we wrote it. And you can see the image on like the fourth page there, where Aaron, kind of sketched a grid and put a pin in it, like you said. And I think that this often comes up in conversations with Tara when we think about children in the classroom and how they get labeled over time. So whether she was teaching first grade, kindergarten, fifth grade, especially as she was in the older grades, children would come into her classroom with this kind of the way that others would talk about the student or assumptions about a student. And she's really masterful, I feel, at resisting those and really seeing children each like fully, human in the sense of the way she interacts with them. I mean, I've been in her classroom for a number of years, and it's really stunning to see how she interacts with children who often have been labeled as struggling or misbehave, that they don't fit in school or they're in trouble a lot. And the way she creates relationships with them, it's hard to put it into words. And so I've just been in awe of watching kind of how she does that. And so I think, she would be the best person to answer how we don't reinforce sticking the pins on the grid and having them be so fixed and stable. But I think the example in here is one of those, and I'm going to forget what pseudonym we used. For the three-dimensional turtle, we used Jamar's three-dimensional turtle, but he was definitely a child, if you had walked into her classroom, that for many it might be uncomfortable, might label him with particular labels around his behavior, his learning, and yet inviting him to be a writer in these ways and playful literacies really, shifted or changed, I think, where the pen was on the grid, so to speak, and how the school talked about him. And so I think, again, Mitzi, it goes back to these everyday, perhaps mundane relational moments in classrooms that produce a different world, a different relationship, and perhaps different identities. I don't know if we want to say that, but we can play around with thinking about that. And we talk about not just this example, but if you look back across the scholarship that Tara and I have written together, we have a piece called Everybody Has a Neil, which was in language arts. We have in our book, particular children that we are intentional to write about, but hesitant how we label them, but would probably be seen as those struggling readers. That's the label that's used here a lot in the US, or struggling writers. But they become in different ways when you invite them to be learners in different ways. And that goes back to that time, space, and materials. And I would say trust, Mitzi. Trust is a word that Tara and I talk about a lot. And I reminded of Karen, your work and others about, trusting children to be like fully who they are in this moment in time, that we're not just trying to get them to be an adult someday or an adult way of learning or thinking, but in that moment, who they are, and trusting them, to make decisions about their literacies and about their learning. And so that would be kind of a rambling answer of something I'm still thinking about, Mitzi, but I don't know if that provoked other thoughts or questions.
Yeah. It made me think of something that you've been about for a long time, and a lot of people that we work with is a curriculum of uncertainty, that if you don't know what's different ways, and kids have been labeled when they walk into our classrooms. And I see that in Tara's work, that she has no idea what's going to go on, that there's these provocations that get put out there for kids. And that to me is, I think, part of this. It still is difficult, though, once these labels get pinned on humans,
Mm-hmm.
big or little, to get them beyond those.
Mm-hmm. And Tara had in the US context, we often have children who might have been identified or labeled needing special education services, and being in those small committee meetings or spaces where she's really tried to unpin the grid, so to speak. It's those mundane conversations that might seem inconsequential that, she tries to open up other possibilities for that student or that learner, and really advocate in ways, for what we call their individual instruction, their IEP plan here. And so I think that's how she finds ways to try to not stick to the grid of how they've always been labeled, and open or offer different possibilities during those committee meetings, those conversations with parents, with administrators. So I think there's a lot of these everyday interactions that really make the world for these children.
And do the kids are they part of these conversations in any ways?
Which ones? The ones that are like,
yeah, like during the IEPs, for example, are kids out of the room?
I'm guessing the kids are out of the room. I have not been with her during those conversations, but traditionally that's been the case of what I have experienced.
Thank you, Candace and Mitzi. Mitzi, I'm just going to read 2 comments that are in the chat box, and maybe we can just, we don't have to necessarily answer them, Candace, but they can form part of the conversation. So Petra de Pries has written, my question relates to what and why and how can / do we retain in post talk? For example, is there a place for identity talk in posthumanism, or is it predeterministic? Is it necessary to talk about identity markers and subjectivity? Is subjectivity not enough? And then the caveat, extremely interesting discussion. Thank you. So that's important. And then Mitzi Chung is had to leave, but thank you, Mitzi, for the comment. She's written, once we live in this world, we all have often been labeled by others. Yet I wonder if all these labelings become our identity. To me, identity is how we ourselves think and believe who we are. However, it is very hard not to take how others identify who we are in this line of thinking. To me, what is or how subjects will live in a classroom or in a world or in a story is how we individually identify and speak ourselves as who we are. And these individuals become a subject or a group of a classroom. Subjects of a group of a classroom. Also, depending on what kinds of collective subjects are pedagogically in a classroom or in a story, they will create a different world or story. Thank you for sharing your stories, and she's sorry she has to go now, but she's enjoyed listening to both you and Mitzi today. So Candace, I'll leave that up to you. Either you can, oh shame, I think I'm going to ask you to respond. I think Mitzi's just got, she's struggling a little bit with her connection. So maybe you could make a response. It also connects to Constantinus's earlier question about identity. Would you like to talk to some of that before we get back to?
Yeah, I mean, so the first one about, is there a place for, or is it necessary to have identity and subjectivity? I mean, I think the reason that I've spent time thinking and writing about it is because I would see them used as synonyms. And so people would say, identity and subjectivity as if those are the same things. And so as I read more, post-philosophers thinking around subjectivity, I was just trying to find a space to understand myself. Are those the same things? So I don't know for me if it's so much as letting go of the word, so to speak, but trying to just better understand myself, how post-philosophers think about subjectivity, like who we are and our becoming in the world. And so for me, kind of that was the kind of intellectual exercise that I was trying to do with these pieces. And then the other comment, so I would say yes and no in some ways to what Mitzi put here, how we individually identify and speak ourselves as who we are. I mean, yes, in some sense, it matters how we see ourselves, but, in the relational field or in the subjectivity and the coming to be, it's about the in-between or the togetherness or the relational piece of kind of all together. And so it's not so much just about what I think about myself. So I think that's a really complicated and nuanced thing to consider. So maybe that's a both and or a yes and no kind of thinking for that one.
Perfect. Thank you.
Welcome back, Mitzi.
Yeah, thanks. I'm on with a phone now, so this should make it through the rest of the time.
Thanks, Mitzi. Mitzi, it's 5 o'clock and we have one more paper, but do you have one more burning question that you'd like to share about the frictional matters paper, or are you ready to move to the next one?
I'm ready to move. There were a number of questions. These are not necessary to answer, Candace, but just so they're out there. But going back to Barad's idea of identity as a verb, and if we're thinking about that individuals don't pre-exist, how do we think about identity in that mix? And it is complicated. So I don't think we necessarily need to move on that, but that came up quite a bit in the conversation. So I'm taking it, we're moving on to the third article.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okie doke.
Thanks.
So paper 3, Using, producing qualitative inquiry pedagogies within lively packets of relations. And Candace, when I first was reading this, I thought, is it using, is it using? Because my first thought was it might be using, but then it seemed like it was using. So just want to double check on that.
It is using. So I put the hyphen and to try to distinguish that. Yeah.
So I think this paper is a great provocation to invite us to rethink what post-qualitative inquiry curricula might look like. I mean, those classes get done and redone and redone. And this was a chance to really think differently. And again, as in your other papers, again, the foregrounding of tensions and contradictions in this was very, very helpful. Putting post theories into real life is not always easy. So I really, really appreciated that. My question is that I want to hear more about the entanglement of us. When you say that using is already human, non-human, more than human, still the word has kind of a very human connotation to it as us. So you also talk about how it's distinguished from collaboration, and I'd like you to talk about that a little bit more. So I'm just thinking, what is that difference? And also, I'm wondering what using gets us in relation to concepts like becoming with or entanglements or assemblages. How do you see that fitting in with those? So I guess the first part of it is distinguishing using from collaboration, and then where this fits in with other concepts that we've been using.
Yeah. So also I'll note that this paper actually was written before the other two that we've discussed today. So if you think about like a chronological linear time, this piece came out many years before the other two literacy pieces that we've talked about. So this comes from more of a partnership with Becky Christ, and we've been thinking a lot over the years about how we go about teaching people to become inquirers in the higher ed setting, specifically in the qualitative research curriculum at our institutions. And so this is one of the earlier pieces that we wrote together. I mean, since then we have written a book called Speculative Pedagogies of Qualitative Inquiry. So that's sort of more of the newer thinking around this. But I would say for this, Mitzi, I mean, I think we were struck by this quote by Daniel Smith, which is on page 967 about packets of relation. So that phrase really stuck with us as we were looking across the data from some of these qualitative research classes that we've taught. And I will say that these classes were your introductory qual class. So the class that we're talking about here was not a class that was reading post theories. It wasn't a post-structural or a post-qual class. These were sort of your standard interpretivist qualitative research courses. But for us, it was about how these post-philosophies are embodied pedagogically. Like we could not think with them when we were thinking about setting up the class. And so if you'll notice the headings throughout, I mean, this was a hard piece to write because it's linear, two-dimensional on paper. And we're trying to articulate in some way these lively packets of relations, which we came to use this term using. Because often we think of teachers making the decisions, planning out what students would read, what the assignments are. But as we would talk and have these meetings together as the two instructors for the class, we really were thinking more about it's us, meaning it's all the material discursive bodies that are a part of that course. And so we tried, like starting on page 969 and onward, the subheadings, you'll see that they're sort of cumulative. And it was a way on paper to try to show that these lively packets of relations are made up of humans. So you can see the first one is Candace, Becky assignment. And then how we tried to just keep layering in these lively packets of relations with things like the Plato, the book discarded library book, paper, the iPhone, tape. And so it becomes more than, it's not just the humans, it's more than humans, space, time, peers. And so we really see using, the us is not the human us. It's the more than human us. It's all of these things that are a part of these lively packets of relations that come to be in these mundane kind of everyday classroom interactions that then produce what we hope are maybe different qualitative researchers in the academy. So did that answer, or do you want me to expand on anything else there, Mitzi, that you were asking?
Yeah, so how does this, okay, I understand the lively packets piece in this, but I'm still a little stuck on the term using. And can you talk about that in relation to some of the other terms that we use, becoming with? Does it, is it a synonym for that? Is there something different? Same thing with entanglements.
Yeah. So I think it's very similar probably with becoming with, entanglements. I think for us, when we wrote this piece and we were inviting students to create with these artistic and digital tools, some of the conversation or what we'd hear at conferences or, responses on manuscripts was that it's really arts-based. This term collaboration would come up a lot. How is it like just collaborative pedagogy? And so I think for us, we're trying to think of those terms, specifically collaboration, kind of a more human-centric logic that, we put two students together and they collaborate together. And there's almost this separation, or in some sense, and kind of relying on more humanist notions. And so for us, it wasn't quite collaboration what we were trying to articulate. It was more of this emergent, so maybe the becoming with, the entanglement that's happening in classroom spaces, kind of the agential cuts that get made. It's not always like this intentional, like collaboration might be, hey, we're going to do this, then we're going to do this, and you kind of plan it out, and it becomes this kind of linear step of making a three-dimensional object in a classroom or something. And that's not what we felt best described what we were thinking about pedagogically in the classroom space. I think, when we read Deleuze and Guattari and others, and they talk about concepts, they're like on the move always. They're sometimes it's helpful to sort of have a new one to think with that might help us think differently than one we've always been thinking with. And so I think, you could use maybe becoming with or entanglement. But I think for Becky and I, it was this notion of us really situated in the teacher-student binary, which is often a humanist perspective of a classroom space. And then trying to think about that us as the more than human that's also happening in the space.
Great. There's a question that came out of the group that kind of, I think, follows from this. And the question was, since you have a post-human, post-qualitative stance, why did you focus on Gigi as the protagonist of the research?
Well, I think this goes again where we live in binaries. I mean, very much classroom spaces are typically about people. So I'm the instructor. There are students in the classroom, but yet at the same time, it's more than that always. And so, Gigi, we were fascinated with her becoming with these materials when we invited students to create in this way. But we were hoping, like we said, with our headers and the way that we were trying to articulate using, that it's not about Gigi. It's about the using that Gigi is a part of, but we're a part of that, as well as, the theories she was thinking with, as well as the materials that we put out, plus the ones she pulled in that we did not expect. And so, to us, it's all of that. But again, as a teacher, it's not about getting rid of the humans. The humans are very much a part of classrooms and spaces that we learn in. And so they're very important to me as well, Mitzi. So yeah, it's just hard. I think it's hard to write in a linear kind of academics piece about classrooms. And then I'm not trying to get rid of the humans. It's about the humans and all the rest too.
Thank you, Mitzi and Candace. And Candace, I hope you are taking a sip of water in between. That you're working very hard. Thanks so much. I have a question too, but I see that Hillary's hand is up, and Karen seems to be moving closer and closer to her screen. So I'll let Hilary ask her question. And
Candace, if I can maybe ask Mitzi's question in a different way. Was Gigi, did she stand out in this class, or did the other students all have rich ussings?
Good question, Hilary.
I mean, it's really a question about cherry picking in a way.
Yes. Yeah. What data do you choose to work with? Yeah. And it's been so long, like this was probably 2016 or so. So I'm trying to think back. I mean, in that class, it was a really large class. There were over 20, maybe 23 doctoral students. And we've written about others in that class and other pieces. So it's that kind of idea of slicing up the data and writing about it in different ways. So yes, there were others in that class that we did choose to think and work with, you know, in other publications. I think the reason we selected Gigi's for this particular piece to think about, I mean, one, she is an art educator. So in some sense, she is very comfortable with making. Where others in the classroom, you know, really froze or resisted or were hesitant when we invited them. And so we've written about those in other spaces too. But for this, I think it was really the playfulness of just the cutting. It was just like, it wasn't that, it didn't seem like that intentional where some students would sit there and like freeze and then kind of plan out what they were going to try to do. She jumped right in as soon as we said, like, go, basically. And also her use of technology and materials that we had not told her to use were really fascinating to think about time and space, because she was putting it out there on Instagram at the same time that, you know, we're in this, and we were shocked, like we didn't know that that was happening. And so I think in some sense we did pick it because it seemed like a rich example to really think through some of the concepts. But there were others as well that, you know, we've written about in other spaces. So that's probably a short answer, Hilary.
Thank you, Candace. Karen, did you have a question, or can I ask? I've got a particular question. Thanks. Candace, in the reading group last week, we sort of did something, I suppose, experimental, because we decided to stop at the image of Gigi on 971, which obviously online is in bright, vibrant color, and obviously in a printed copy, black and white. But and we sort of decided to think about. So I suppose I'm asking you almost a methodological question about how do you read images when you're writing in an experimental way and playing with data? How do we not keep valuing your analysis that is written in Word on the right-hand side of the page? And so we had to force ourselves to go and stay there. And it was and I see Sarah's in the room too, and David and a couple of other people. So maybe just a comment, because we're trying this work, you know, we're trying to do the work and play of, like Mitzi mentioned, how we think about time and value time, but we know we value the written, even though we're writing about how this creation, the art, is doing something different. So maybe just something, I suppose I'm asking a question about how do we do that, where we stop and go, let me spend time looking at what this image is saying without asking for it to be told to me or each other or the world in a different way. Thanks.
Yeah, I listened to the recording, and there was lots of lively conversation around this, which I really enjoyed hearing. Well, I might connect it to Adam's game board. You know, Adam taught us a lot, I think, about the materiality of the world, and how even as the creator of the game board, or even as Gigi as the creator perhaps of this, you know, sculpture or this three-dimensional, it takes on life in each relational encounter that it has, right? And so, like, you know, Adam knew that. He taught that well, that every time someone plays that game board, a different personal narrative will come to be in the world. And so I think not in this piece, but in the book that Becky and I wrote, Gigi appears in the book as well. And she has a three-dimensional woman. She called it a muse. Which I think might have been created the same night in class. I can't remember, but it was theory twisted and woven together as this woman. And she tells us that she kept it with her during the rest of her doctoral program. And it produced different things for her throughout different courses. And so there's a lot going on there, because it's physically made of theory that she was reading. It's a thing. It's like this 3-dimensional paper sculpture, but it was becoming with her over the course of her doctoral degree, and she called it like her muse. So there's a whole thing to think about with that. So I think that helped me think about art in different ways, and how she identifies as an artist, an art educator, and how she understood or seemed to know that the materiality is not just about the here and now and what it might have meant, the meaning making in the moment, perhaps, but about its living in the world through different interactions. And so I would say the same, coming back to this article and the images that are on the page that you referred to, Roseanne, years later. I mean, hearing your conversation last week in the recording and all the questions and the things that it provoked for you all to think about as scholars, as researchers, I mean, it's still living. And it still invites us to think about the decisions we make as a researcher, what gets put on the paper, how we talk about it.
Thank you. I mean, maybe I could just tell everybody else what we did as a group was we said, stay with the picture and let's not move along. And we kind of challenged each other to then talk with the image. So thank you, Candace, for what you've, and I mean, I probably shouldn't, but I have a slight follow-up, but maybe not for an answer, but something to think about, because I'm also I work with children's art, and because Gigi's, but you brought up, I know you've mentioned Adam, but we afford adults a different kind of understanding when it comes to art and not children. And I think there's so much work to be done in terms of that when we're using children's art in our writing. So, but I'm going to take what you've said today. Thank you. That's been really helpful to think about each relational encounter, which I know, but now the reminding that has to happen when it is we're doing this work in the academy. Thank you. I'm going to ask Mitzi if she has another. We're doing well. I mean, we've got 18 minutes past 5. I'm going to ask Mitzi if she has another comment, and then or question, and then I'm going to open it up to the rest of the group again. So Mitzi?
So there is a few more questions besides that brainstorming that went on. Let me ask this. There's 2 of them that I'm loving here, but what does creativity look like in a post-human paradigm?
Yeah, I loved hearing that recording last week, and I've thought a lot about it. And then I was brought back, I think I was reading some other piece. I forget what I was reading since I listened to your recording. And it was drawing upon Deleuze and Guattari's idea, that thinking and thought are not synonyms in their writing. And, Matsumi writes about, a shock to thought and how we often do little thinking. And creativity, Deleuze talks about a lot in relation to thinking. And then if we look at what is philosophy by Deleuze, and we think about Deleuze and Guattari's writing about concepts and that they are creative, fabricated, they're always on the move. We can't really pen them down. I see a lot of overlaps, I think, for me at least, in what we might call creativity and what we might call thinking. And so I see them as very much related. And so I think if we use the example in here with Gigi and the sculpture that she's creating, some people would call it arts-based, which it could be maybe termed arts-based pedagogy. But I think that in the conversations we'd have with students after having classes, they would talk about the new thinking that emerged for them in these entanglements with theory. They're printed out transcripts from, interviews, from materials. And so it seemed very generative to them, at least, that newness of thinking came to be in the making and the doing together. And we didn't use the term creativity necessarily, but it seems to align with some of the thinkers like Deleuze and Guattari's writing on thinking, Matsumi's writing, and others that talk about kind of those two side by side, thinking and the making or the creativity. So I appreciated hearing you all wrestle with that as well.
Mitzi, do you want to, thank you, Candace. Mitzi, do you want to do the last question? And then you said there were 2, so maybe you can do the last.
Okay, so the last one from that group, well, there were more, but the one that I chose was this idea of how do we disrupt the concept of classrooms as they are. most of the focus is on humans and materials in the service of humans. And, you know, you wrote about all the stuff that are there. There's just so much material aspects of a classroom. And how do we start disrupting this more traditional notion of classrooms, especially in the political world we're in right now?
Yeah. Wow. That's like your $1 million question, Mitzi.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, I think for me, I mean, just I guess across, even when I was teaching kindergarten and first grade myself and up into higher education now, I mean, I was often labeled as the rebel teacher, which I was the one that the principal would always be like, you know, a blanket statement, but it was really about what I was choosing to do in my classroom, you know. So I think for me, relational pedagogies has always been my interest, because I feel like now reading the different philosophies that I'm reading has helped me have a language to talk about why the everyday matters. And how we are trying to disrupt, I would say for myself, like trying to disrupt a system of how schooling looks, especially in the US context that I've been a part of, whether that's PK-12 or if it's in higher education. And, you know, while some say we should tear the systems down, there's always going to be a system that grows back in its place. And so for me, it's thinking about how to work within and against the system at the same time, and how to do it in ways that produce a different world for the better. And so in a higher education context, like this particular piece, you know, it's a traditional qualitative research class. Every grad student has to take it in my college, but can I invite them into a pedagogical space that is felt and experienced and embodied differently than other classes that they've had, and helps them think about that inquiry can look differently than what the academy tells you it should look like, and that it's important that we think of it differently because it's going to produce our communities, the world in different ways. And so for me, like that's the justice and ethical piece, is that if we want the world to be differently as academics, then we have to think differently about how we go about inquiring in the world and what that looks like. So for me, like that's the hopefulness. And, you know, even talking to some of my students 2 or 3 years out, once they finish their program, you know, there was something about their shock to thought in the class that stays with them as they navigate very neoliberal kind of patriarchal spaces in the academy. They have to navigate their disciplinary expectations, tenure promotion, journal acceptances, but how do you do that in ways that allow you to be playful and experimental as well? So I think that's the constant conundrum, I would say, Mitzi, as, you know, advisors, as faculty in the academy. You gave me permission to do that, Mitzi, so thank you.
Thanks, Candace and Mitzi. And I see we've got a question from Sarah, and then I'll try and rein us all in and maybe give Candace and Mitzi 1 minute to end us off. Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks, Candace. This has just been really, really wonderful. You talk about, and I love the way you talk about doing differently in higher ed as you teach qualitative methods. That is a requirement in the program. And you talk about sort of unleashing playfulness and experimentation. And I want to also say that this is dangerous work for many. Matt, I have 2 wonderful colleagues in Florida who are teacher educators and working within both the higher ed system that is now surveilling emails and that kind of stuff, and tenure and promotion issues, but also they're working with teachers who are incredibly vulnerable when they take on innovative, you know, busings. Okay, and also preparing teachers who are going to be in that system. And so I think it's both helping people see that they can be playful and push the envelope. But I think thinking about the care and the support, and it may require, you know, connections with lawyers. And I think that it's important to acknowledge the dangerousness of the work, and that the people who are most vulnerable are often not the tenured, white, privileged people. And so I don't know, I just want to add that notion that this is dangerous work for men, for the least vulnerable, most vulnerable.
Thank you, Sarah. Mitzi and Candace, I'm sorry, I'll just read Constantinus as he wrote, that's the $1 million answer, Candace, purely fantastic. So thank you. And we do have, it's always difficult as we race to the Hoppers 5-minute, but Mitzi, you've done an incredible job with these provocations, with your careful reading of Candace's work. It just speaks so much to your relationship. So I'd like to say thank you to you for that. And then Candace, thank you for the generous way you've not necessarily answered the questions, but you've talked us through ways of thinking, which is actually possibly even, I mean, that's really very valuable. So just thank you for the way you've helped us to think today, think more, think differently, be differently. And so maybe each of you could just take 1 minute to do a little, I don't know, something you didn't say or wanted to say. And then we can just see if there's one more comment from the group. Candace, or maybe I'll let Mitzi. Mitzi, is there one thing you'd like to add or say?
Well, yeah, I really, Candace, in your work, one of the things that I really appreciate because of my own work is that how you're always giving examples of how to be differently, whether it's in classrooms or in higher ed. And as I started working, you know, your work has, you know, I wasn't using your work in the very beginning after you first got done. And all of a sudden, I was listening to some kids who were talking about book covers that they were making for their stories that they were writing. And they started talking about how the paper made me do this, and this color all of a sudden gave me the idea to do something else. And I remember rushing back to your work, to Len's Taguchi, to who did I read it first? Other folks, and then Barad, who blew my mind and still is blowing it. So I really want to thank you for like getting me on a path to make sense of some of the things that I heard going on in classrooms that I didn't know what to do with, that were shocking. So thanks.
Oh, thank you, Mitzi. Thanks. And Candace, maybe just maybe a closing comment or thought from you?
Yeah, I mean, this has been so generative, a lovely conversation, a space where it felt okay to not know to answer, like you said, Roseanne, I don't have an answer. I don't have everything understood, or yeah. So it's writing is very vulnerable, as you all know. And so, you know, just looking across publications over years and putting things out in the world and not knowing how they might be received or what they might produce or do. So this has been exciting to kind of see how things that I've written about with Tara or others are continuing to have lively kind of relations with you all. And so thank you so much for just a space to be vulnerable in that way and to say, I don't know, or I'm still just thinking about the messiness of this myself, and to hearing how you all are also doing the same. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I hope if anybody has a quick comment, you're welcome. Karen, maybe you'd like to say something. And
well, I'm just looking at time, so maybe just shall I just close our meeting? And just very much enjoyed listening. I was struck again, Candace, by also your responses, the way you talk, the way you write is phenomenal, actually. So yeah, really enjoyed that. And what I just wanted to mention, that this is the last one for a bit, because we're having a break in the north. This is a summer break. In the south, it will be a winter break, and that will come back in September. And we will be focusing on the digital, on the camera, and Søren Finn Manning is going to lead that month through different readings, and also has invited Christina McRae. So yeah, please tune in for more. And also, if you like these kind of spaces, these kind of discussions, followed the chat, and was just amazing. People's very positive responses. We've got reading groups that will continue during this break. We've got 3 running every week. So if you want to know more, George is your contact, and also is having a break at some point. But yeah, she's your contact. And yeah, thank you very much for coming, and have a wonderful evening, afternoon, wherever you are in the world. And of course, thank you, Roseanne, for your fantastic difficultating as always.
Thanks everyone. No, I feel very energized. It's Monday afternoon, I'm ready. Thank you all. Thanks so much. Mitzi, lovely to meet you. Thank you, Candace. Be well and safe, everyone.
Yes.
Thank you, George.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.